Yeah, hello, good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to this Telecoms Industry Outlook for 2015. My name is Dave McNally, an instructor with the Telecoms Academy, and I'll be taking you through this the next 30 minutes or so, and we'll have a quick look at where we think the industry is going. It should take 30-35 minutes or so to get through the content that we've got prepared for you, and we'll take a few questions at the end of the session. Right, so let's just do a few introductions. So as I say, my name is Dave McNally, and I'm working for the Telecoms Academy. And if I can just get my next slide up. It's not. 1 second. Here we go. Right, it's working now. Right, yeah. So Telecoms Academy. We're a training company that offer a range of different training materials. So we've got skilled telecoms management, where we deal with a lot of business-related topics, including we have the Telecoms Mini MBA. We've got commercial leadership, marketing training, as well as training on technologies. Of course, technology overviews, LTE training, in-depth planning courses, and such like. And we also offer most of our content is also offered on a distance learning basis. And on that distance learning, one or two of the other sort of classroom programs, we've also got university accredited programs. We have a relationship with Derby University, where it's possible to do some classroom study, some distance learning study, and we can offer university accreditation, university certification as part of the training program. If you've got any sort of inquiries or you want to know more about what we do directly, then of course we have our website there, and also an email address there for sort of general inquiries, and a phone number for contact as well. Now, as part of this presentation, we'll be using a lot of data which we pull from the Ovum Knowledge Centre. Now, Ovum and Telecoms Academy were sort of part of the same organisation, so we have access to their full sort of back catalogue of industry data. So quite a lot of the stuff that you're going to see here is taken from sources such as we've got the Intelligence Centre, the World Telecom Financial Benchmarks, Cellular Information Service, and so on. There's a whole sort of raft of data and analysis that you can pull from the from the Knowledge Centre. Excuse me. Right. Okay. I'll put up the contact slide again at the end. So if you've got any direct inquiries and so on related to training or the Ovum products, then of course you can contact us. You can contact us directly. But what we're going to have a look at for the next 30 minutes or so, we'll have a look at the current industry position. So we'll pull some data out the financial benchmarks and make some comparisons with previous years. We'll talk about the way in which the telco industry is changing, and the changing attitudes of the customer with respect to the services that are being offered by the CSPs, the communication service providers. And we'll look at both fixed and mobile broadband forecasts and try and analyse a few of the trends that we see there. And we'll also look at the overall approaches, the strategies being taken by the communication service providers. So we'll look at a big picture, and then we'll perhaps focus a little bit on the technologies. And quite a lot of what we talk about really is related to the end user services, and of course that means we have to talk about digital services, business to business, big data, and how those services are being handled by the operators, or how we're thinking about innovation and change. Right, so we'll dive straight into it. We haven't got a great deal of time, so we're probably going to go through this sort of fairly quickly. But we are making a recording of this presentation, which Paul Waite, our marketing guy, will make available to you a bit later in the week. And also, when we get to the end of this, I'll put up a link where you can download this particular presentation, so that you have access to the slides and also a recording of the information a little bit later. So the current industry position then. Well, one of the bits of data we can pull out of the telecoms financial benchmarks is we can look at the industry as a whole, and we can look at the overall revenues that we see, and try and identify a bit of a trend here. Now, I think overall we're in a sort of fairly healthy position at the moment. I mean, compared to maybe the same point last year. So first quarter 13, we're in a bit of a lull there. but certainly towards the end of last year, we'd definitely have a bit of a bump in overall revenues here, perhaps sliding off a little bit, but the industry in general is sort of fairly stable just now. And I think when you compare the operators in terms of their overall revenues, it's sort of dominated by the American operators. We've got AT&T and Verizon on the far left there. The Japanese operator, Chinese operator, of course, coming up at 3 or 4 positions, 3 and 4 there. Now the year-on-year growth. I mean, I had a look at last year's data when I put this information in the slide, and we're seeing a bit of a growth trend here. I mean, like last year, the year-on-year growth was sitting at around about 0%. So in that sort of 12-month period that's passed thus far, we're into sort of positive territory here. So the market's growing, around about 2% or so at the moment. This is a range. I think this is taken from about 45 different operators around the world. So it should give us a pretty good overall benchmark about the state of the industry and the direction which it's heading. So we've got a positive growth there of 2% or so, which is probably manageable. It's not a scary large figure, and it's certainly not a negative figure. So perhaps nothing to be overly concerned about in terms of overall growth. And for telecoms, the classic industry benchmark that we like to look at, EBITDA. So running currently about 32% on average across the industry, across the 45 operators or so that we use to create these charts. Now that compared to last year, it's about 0.5% down. I think we're at about 33% or 33.2% or so from last year. So perhaps a little bit of a reduction in the EBITDA margins. But again, when you look at the trend since first quarter 13, so over that sort of 12-month period, that measure of financial efficiency is really staying fairly stable over the last 12 months or so. So again, I think we can probably conclude from those revenue figures that the industry, even though it's an extremely challenging time for the industry, for reasons that we'll explain over the next few minutes or so, the industry is looking fairly stable in its current position. And one of the challenges, of course, that we face, and we've faced for a number of years, is market saturation. It's a really tough job to be an operator in a market which is saturated above 100%. So when we look at this sort of Central and Eastern European figure, we're at sort of, I think it says about 143% or so. Western Europe 127%, and this makes it extremely difficult for the operator to think of and present new services to sort of be exciting, in the face of a lot of competition. And the operators really have to adapt to work successfully in this market. Now, adaptation from the point of view of new products and services, perhaps, or to be able to maintain profitability. I think focusing internally on overall efficiency mechanisms, I think, is something that the operators continue to focus on in these kind of markets. ARPU is another sort of classic benchmark that we like to look at in telecoms, and we're comparing here 2013 through 2015, and then making some forecasts for out towards 2019 for different regions. So Africa, Southern America, Southern Asia, North America. Now certainly North America wins in the who's making the biggest ARPU figures, but I think the overall trend here across the different markets is the important message to get over. And there is a gradual slide over the next 5 years or so with ARPU, but it's not a significant dip. I mean, to my mind, when you look at these statistics of ARPU, it's pretty steady. Okay, it's not changing dramatically over that period of time, which, despite the fact that the markets are extremely saturated and there's a terrific amount of competition in the market, we can say that the ARPU stability is a positive sign. Now, this is just the should we say, the overall blended ARPU. So it's not possible by looking at these numbers here to figure out exactly where that revenue is coming from. But if we break that down a little bit further, and again here we're looking at specific operators from different parts of the world. We're comparing the overall ARPUs and trying to pull out here what is the voice-based ARPU and as we might call it, the non-voice-based ARPU or data. Now, I think that there's another positive message in here that I think the tide is gradually beginning to change in favor of data. So the operators are beginning to see significant revenues. In fact, in most cases, above 50% of their revenues now coming from data sources. Now, whether that's sort of direct content-driven revenue, or whether it's more connection fee-driven revenue, again, it's a bit difficult to tell from these particular figures. But for the most part, I think that the revenue is coming from mobile broadband connectivity fees more than direct content-based fees. There's a couple of sort of notable sort of winners, I suppose, in here. And when we look at the Japanese market here, so SoftBank and KDDI, very, very significant portion of their revenues is really coming from these data sources. Now it's largely, I think, down to sort of cultural trends and the way the Japanese operators, the Japanese subscribers tend to engage with new services, new digital services very, very quickly. So that tends to be a little bit of a it bucks the trend, perhaps above the average in that case. But so running at about 50%, in some cases more than 50% of revenue is now coming from data services, which I think again is a positive message. Perhaps still not time to relax here, because given that most of those revenues are likely coming from sort of connectivity fees, it's extremely important at this sort of early stage of digital services and the and thinking about convergence strategies. It's extremely important that we don't lose sight of how we can maximize those fees, and how perhaps we can, at least in the minds of the subscriber, make the subscriber feel like that they're paying for content and services rather than just connections. I think that's going to be an important trend. Now, this is actually from Ericsson Mobility Report. It's a nice little graph, really, showing the continued growth of data. I mean, there's absolutely no surprises here at all. That data continues to rise extremely rapidly, and in fact, when we compare that with voice, the small sort of the small yellow bars here, voice is growing very gradually. Maybe that's down to the number of mobile voice connections that continue to be made. But clearly, demand for data is one of those things that outstrips pretty much anything else as far as the operators are concerned. I mean, that one graph alone sort of justifies the need for the next generation technologies, such as, of course, LTE Advanced and tending towards 5G. But I mean, there are other graphs. I'm not going to show them here, but there are other graphs that try to break down exactly what that data is. But you'll probably find about 70% of those red lines that you see on this graph are pretty much video based. So we're talking about streaming, downloading video content and such like, and that's kind of one of the main drivers for most operators towards the high capacity technologies like LTE, small cells, even things like Wi-Fi offload and so on, are kind of driven by this particular trend. So let's think a little bit about the I guess the changing relationship between the telco customer and the telco provider, the communication service provider. So for a long time I suppose the subscriber has been should we say content with the fact that where they wanted to source different kinds of content, so stuff that you would use on your PC versus content that you would stream on your TV, and then other perhaps slightly more advanced applications such as sort of health and music and so on. We've been fairly content up until now to source that information from different companies, from different organizations and so on. But more and more, I think the operator needs to be sort of centralized in this. I mean, the operator clearly is the pipe through which we can deliver all of these services. But there's a much more important role for the operator here in terms of instead of just being the connection provider, you're being the broker of those services and managing the financial transactions associated with purchasing premium TV content or downloading applications and such like to our various devices. And more and more, I think the consumer perhaps doesn't see the difference so much between the different kinds of devices. And I think one of our analysts at some point made the comment that The only difference between the multitude of different devices that we're using these days, in fact, is quite simply the size of the screen. So whether you're in your TV, your mobile, your tablet, your PC, we're actually engaging with and using almost exactly the same kind of content. So we can stream the movie to the TV, we can stream the movie to the mobile phone, the computer, the laptop, and so on. So really, the experience of the consumer is that whatever device I happen to have in my hand or happen to be sat in front of at the moment is the device which I want to use to engage with that content. So clearly the operator has quite a big responsibility to sit in that position between the mobile, between the consumer and between the content. But as ever with these sort of value chains, it's identifying our position in the value chain and trying to determine where the revenue opportunities are. So where can we make the money out of this, and what should our specific role be in the delivery, the handling of the content, the brokering of the transactions, and such like. So just back to a couple of trends here. Now this is coming from the World Cellular Data Metrics tool provided by Ovum. Now this is actually the figures from last year, and I thought I'd just throw this up because there's some interesting trends in here. Certainly when we look at things like the number of text messages, number of MMSs, and so on, the average data ARPUs, voice ARPUs, and so on. So clearly we have some numbers in there, but the interesting thing is the direction in which those numbers are moving. So the latest data that we have from that particular tool is showing, no surprises, I suppose, that there is certainly a downturn in the number of SMS messages, MMS messages, which are being sent. I mean, that's clear evidence, if it were needed, of the strength of the OTTs, the WhatsApp and Facebook and so on. That seems to be the default sort of messaging and communication applications that people will use. Messaging ARPUs, voice ARPU is also on the downturn. Again, perhaps no surprises there. And the positive message that we've seen actually in some of the previous data that we've presented here is that the data ARPUs, in fact, are increasing. So average data ARPU is increasing, and as we call it, the non-messaging data ARPU is also increasing. So as a direct result of the data ARPU increase, of course, there's a much bigger percentage of revenue coming directly from data. So we've got figures of sort of I'm not sure. I think probably a billion figure in there, is it? So yeah, certainly total data revenues are on the increase, and also a fairly obvious trend, I suppose, is that the number of mobile broadband subscriptions that are in circulation is also on the increase. I mean, this also is supported by the figures that we can show related to smartphone penetration in most markets these days, which is also extremely high. The number of operators deploying data as well is also increasing. So I suppose in retrospect there's probably not a great deal of surprise here in that messaging numbers and revenues are down, but those related to the data services are directly on the increase. But these are revenues which can be attributed also to the directly to the operators rather than to the OTTs. So the customer's experience, it continues to be dominated by the OTTs. I mean, the reason we buy smartphones and use smartphones is really because of the whole host of different applications and common applications that we can use, like Facebook, Twitter, Skype, and such like. So yeah, people's experience really is being defined by what we can do with the mobile, and what we can do with the mobile itself is probably defined more often than not by the provision of the OTT services. So the operators perhaps find themselves in this sort of slightly uncomfortable position as being the provider of the connection. But we do see some changes in that, because so something that's been evidenced for quite a long time is that partnerships between the operator and the providers of the content are increasingly important. And in those sort of emerging markets where prepaid is the sort of predominant style of subscription, it's possible to buy access on a sort of daily basis, very sort of cost-effective daily basis, to services like WhatsApp and so on. So the operators are sort of reselling, should we say, WhatsApp branded services on a very small incremental basis to those prepaid users. So nobody is committed to buying to buying sort of your monthly or yearly contracts with expensive data plans, and they may be buying access to daily data specifically to gain access to to one or two different OTT applications. So there are opportunities there to monetize these OTT applications, but in conjunction, in partnership with those OTT providers. So there's evidence that it can be done. It's not necessarily an easy thing to do. It perhaps isn't going to work for all markets, depending on the maturity of the market and the subscribers in that market. And as we mentioned before, the smartphone market is clearly a big market, and your predictions at the moment are saying that about 80% or so of handsets sold worldwide will be smartphones by it says 2065 there for some reason. By 2016, that should probably say. So there are clearly big geographical differences. When you look in the US and Europe, of course, the penetration is going to be somewhat higher, and those emerging markets like India and Africa a great deal less, largely because of the cost of the devices. But we see companies like Motorola producing relatively low cost LTE enabled handsets. I think it's the Moto E, which has recently been updated, is available for it's about $110 or so, but that brings sort of high speed connectivity to a smartphone format that's more accessible to markets like those that you would find in India and Africa. And of course, as the cost of the smartphone begins to come down, as the connection speeds increase and the countrywide connectivity improves, then the smartphone penetration will begin to increase in those markets as well. Now that another part of the operator's sort of portfolio of services, of course, is going to be cloud, and we probably all understand to an extent what the cloud is, but I think the operator's position is, what does the cloud mean to them as a sort of technical organization, with both consumer type customers and enterprise type, and maybe the question is the operator going to be the provider of cloud and cloud services to both their consumers and enterprise customers, or would the operator be the user of a cloud service? Now, there may be sort of a happy combination between two of those things, because as data storage requirements increase, as we don't want to commit to big expensive data centers and so on, perhaps there is at least in some network functions, there's scope to actually buy in cloud services from third parties to manage and store and to analyze our data and such like. But I think the operator has to be sort of fairly clear. There needs to be a very clear strategy about cloud for the operators, and whether or not, I mean, I suppose one of the concepts here is that the operator could be the cloud provider directly to their customers. So there is a clear sort of B2C market, excuse me, in that case. And if we're going to ramp that up and start thinking about services towards enterprise, this sort of business to business market, then clearly the cloud functionality supported by the operator needs to be a great deal more extensive. And there's more commitment to expensive data centers and data analytics and so on, where we start to think about the business to business. And something we'll talk about a bit later on, we start thinking about Internet of Things and machine to machine and so on. A big market sector is this sort of B2B2C, so business to business to consumer. So effectively handling communication services on behalf of a company who themselves are trying to provide service for their own consumers. So the cloud could perhaps play a role in that. But in terms of what services will we provide for those consumers, those businesses, or those businesses to consumers, is something the operators need to continue to think about. Now, if we look at some sort of some basic broadband forecasts for a couple of minutes, then global broadband, well, it continues to be mobile. The fixed broadband, we'll break this down in a moment or two, but fixed broadband, of course, it's still a big market, but when compared to mobile connectivity, of course, it almost disappears. So for most people, their sort of general access to the internet is basically through a mobile device of some type. Satellite is on this picture, but you can barely see it. It's a very, very small line. But perhaps more interestingly, when we kind of zoom in and break those statistics down a little bit, when we look at the fixed broadband, then the market continues to be dominated by DSL and DSL-like services. I mean, I think when you look at outside of North America, the majority of fixed broadband services continue to be delivered over DSL services, and that's a legacy reason because of the way the fixed infrastructure itself was built. When you start looking at the North American market and one or two other places, then the cable services are the ones that tend to dominate. But I think what we've seen over the last few years, in fact, is the rise of the green here, the FTTX, so fiber to the cabinet, fiber to the home, and so on, and that continues to rise quite steadily. In perhaps more in the developed markets than anywhere else, but certainly fiber is increasingly available, and the market penetration, the reach that fiber is achieving is increasing all the time, and of course we'll be replacing the DSL services or the cable services. I suppose there is a thought here as well about where convergence fits into this, because whether you're coming from a fixed background or a mobile background, there is should we say there is an incentive to become a converged operator. So becoming both a mobile and fixed operator, the broadband strategy that you can adopt across those two positions is clearly going to be important. And delivering sort of high quality TV services, plus the sort of high speed mobile broadband services. We need to look at those high capacity technologies such as LTE on the mobile side, and of course fiber on the fixed side as well. But fiber, clearly is an expensive thing to deploy, and takes rather a long time to deploy as well. And when we look at them on the mobile side, even though LTE is a sort of the new exciting thing which is happening, and of course performance wise it's extremely good. But it is HSPA or HSPA Plus that still continues to dominate that particular market. I mean, for a lot of very good reasons. And whilst most mobile operators in the world, I think there's about 380, 400 operators worldwide now, have an LTE network. Clearly their coverage footprint for the time being is still rather limited, because we've only been building it for 2, 3, 4 years. Also, and also the number of LTE devices in the market are also relatively small. So of course, the number of LTE connections, the number of LTE subscriptions, and therefore the amount of data which is being carried by LTE is still relatively small. So according to the GSM Suppliers Association, of the sort of 2.5 or so billion mobile subscriptions or mobile broadband subscriptions that there are, only around about 7% of those at the moment are LTE subscriptions. So I mean that will continue to dominate for quite a while. I think there has to be more devices in the market. The LTE coverage footprint will have to increase before that will change significantly. So HSPA continues to be the dominant mobile broadband technology, even though we all kind of want the LTE connections. We want the fast connections. So this telco sort of strategy, big picture, there's sort of the checklist that we have here, if you like, is it's a continuing checklist. It's something the operators have been sort of thinking about and aiming for, really for the last sort of 5-10 years or so. But of course, priority remains increasing, maintaining revenues and margins. In some cases where the market allows it, of course, convergence strategies, and there are many different ways of thinking about convergence. Fixed mobile convergence, TV convergence, and so on. There are lots of different sort of roadmaps that we can travel down in that particular direction. But also, given the saturation of the market and given the increased amount of competition that there is in both the fixed and mobile market, then your competitive advantage has to be maintained. Now, whether we do that through speed, okay, build an LTE network, talk about how fast it is and so on. But I think connection speed is one thing. But I think with these new technologies like LTE, I think the coverage that you can offer is also a key metric when it comes to the marketing advantage, the competitive advantage that you might have. But of course, you can always compete on the price. I mean, that's an extremely common thing to do. But increasingly, we see operators focusing on quality of service, perhaps rather than the price of the service. So showing people what they're or representing the customer's value expectations in a much more complex way, rather than just talking about the speed or the price and so on. As well, value-added services, digital services, perhaps, and a compelling device portfolio. All of these things need to be present in order to maintain this competitive advantage. Partnerships and deals with OTT players, that's something that we see happening more and more. And I think more recently, we've seen some sort of fairly big, high-profile mergers and acquisitions in the market, because the cost of doing business, the cost of working in a highly competitive market, means that perhaps the market itself cannot sustain the large number of mobile operators that we typically see in most markets. And I'll show you a slide on that in just a moment or two. Protecting voice revenues as we start to migrate to voice over IP. Now we've got a bit of course, when we start thinking about LTE, we can talk about voice over LTE, which is voice over IP, but we've still got a bit of a lead time on that. So maybe 2 to 3 years before VoLTE becomes anything like mainstream, and in that sort of 2 to 3 years, the OTT players like Skype and Viber and the many others that are out there, perhaps will continue to win the market towards voice over IP. So I think that there's a difficult period, I think, when it comes to voice, because we know voice revenues are on the decline anyway. So I think when it comes to voice services for most operators, I think the focus is probably more on maintaining or increasing the margins associated with voice, rather than focusing directly on the revenues generated from voice. So clearly a move towards voice over IP infrastructure, the VoLTE services and so on, would be one of the ways of actually minimizing the overall costs of that service and perhaps maintaining the margins. So the whole digital media, digital services ecosystem, it's the telecoms market is a big market. You can see it's worth billions and billions of dollars here. But in this particular slide, I mean, the data here is not we're looking at a trend here from 2008 to 2013, but this trend continues, I think, beyond the 2013 date, where the services that we see that have the most growth associated with them are those associated with digital media services and digital advertising. And interestingly, perhaps when you look at the sort of darker blue slice of pie on these charts, the traditional telco services, and that of course is going to be your voice and text and connectivity, perhaps. Those are declining in terms of the value that it brings to the total market. So digital media services, digital advertising. I think over this period, those two categories of media services and advertising has grown at something like 5% over that period. In fact, digital media services, when we look at it in this way, so the compound annual growth over the 5 years to 2013, the digital media certainly has the strongest growth, which is something for the operators to think quite carefully about. Moving forward, though, there's a lot of pressures really on the operators to do this. Now, there's Ovum have run we tend to run surveys fairly often, but in this particular one, the question that's been asked is, over the next 5 years, what's the biggest challenge that mobile operators are going to face? And I think the operator respondents here perhaps is the most interesting side of the side to look at here. But regulatory pressures on pricing. I mean, that's always been around one way or another, but certainly we see here in the UK and Europe, the regulators constantly sort of banging on at the operators that we need to remove those roaming barriers. We need to reduce the roaming tariffs and such like. OTT competitive pressure, that's been around for a while, but it continues to be in the forefront of operator strategy. And as we move towards services that require more and more capacity, availability of spectrum, because building a network with high capacity simply requires that you need more spectrum, or you need to be able to use the available spectrum more efficiently. which is why LTE Advanced is already being rolled out in many markets. So availability of spectrum is something to be concerned of. And because we're building a lot of new infrastructure, the cost of that, perhaps license costs and so on, could be thrown into that particular response as well. Very competitive market. We're always concerned about that. And perhaps the current limitations of the network technology that we have. So as that data, as the data consumption continues to rise and perhaps outstrips the current capability of our HSPA networks, there is this sort of imminent pressure to move towards the high capacity networks, but of course there is a cost incurred with doing that. So which kind of makes life a little bit hard for the operator. Clearly to build and expand and to be more efficient, a lot of money has to be spent. But in this competitive market where revenues perhaps are not as strong as they used to be, perhaps more flat than anything else, then that's it's a business challenge that it has to be faced. Now, as we mentioned sort of before, partnerships are one of these kind of sort of key measures or key importances that operators will find as we move towards, I guess, a connectivity dominated market with the mobile broadband connections and so on. The operators themselves, the connection service providers, are probably extremely unlikely to be creating the content themselves. Therefore, partnerships with the content sources is going to be increasingly important, and there are lots of advantages to doing this. I mean, Vodafone have alongside their LTE subscriptions here in the UK, it's possible to get an LTE mobile broadband subscription from Vodafone, and you get free for a year, Sky Sports or Spotify, and that's one of the ways of really sort of increasing the value expectation of the user. Getting that service for free and signing up a customer for another 12 months probably has a larger number of sort of indirect value creation metrics than direct revenue generating metrics. But clearly operators are looking to monetize all aspects of their business. So not just the connectivity, but maybe exploiting their billing capabilities, having QoS differentiated services perhaps, and there's still a lot of work that could be done related to advertising as well. The operators, they have these large customer bases, they've got a huge amount of customer data, and perhaps exploiting big data is another way of seeking other revenue generating opportunities. And where there's a lot of competition in the markets, the markets themselves are highly saturated. Of course, it's inevitable that we find that various mergers and acquisitions would take place. So here in the UK, fairly recently, of course, BT, British Telecom, they've bought EE, which themselves were recently merged Orange and T-Mobile network. And I think just this week, BT are now launching their 4G services over the EE, and it's really going to stir the market up because there's just a bit of a news headline there. So the BT Mobile arrives in the UK with insanely cheap 4G tariffs. So coming into the market very strongly, very aggressively with a sort of perhaps a price-based strategy is perhaps going to mix the market up quite a bit. And also we have O2 and 3. Operators coming together as a sort of joint venture, I suppose. So really, what we're ending up here with in the sort of highly saturated market like the UK is the total number of operators that we have is decreasing, but perhaps that gives the remaining operators, these sort of big players in the market now, much greater opportunity to become efficient operators, and also opens up the convergence marketplace to those operators. Perhaps BT and EE now are in a very strong position because BT being the dominant fixed operator and EE being the largest mobile operator in the UK, turns it into quite a powerful company as far as the customers might be concerned. Okay, so just a few words on technology here. Question was asked, which technologies and strategies will drive profitable top-line growth in your organization? And the number one answer by quite a long mark here is of course LTE. So yeah, pretty much every operator has an LTE strategy on the roadmap. If we're not already rolling out LTE, then very soon we will be. And those that have LTE, clearly they're looking to increase their coverage footprint to optimize the capacity of the network and such like. Cloud computing comes in at a sort of, well, close-ish second here. And then sort of super fast fixed line broadband, depends on your particular convergence position, of course, in those cases. But LTE is sort of the it's an important milestone on the roadmap of the operator, and one which we're all thinking about really. And why are you building an LTE network? Well, to support video services. I mean, the current networks can do video, but of course, these connected tablets and connected PCs and so on, it's much more likely that we'll be viewing video content as a high definition stream. So that in turn raises the pressure on those on the delivery system, the LTE system. So it's basically all about video. Social networking as well comes in at a fairly distant second. So yeah, build a network that can deliver video services, but then of course, where are you going to get your video services from? And this is where the partnerships become quite key key strategies again. LTE Advanced, well, deployments continue. There's a handful of LTE Advanced networks now in the world, but the LTE Advanced as a technology is really just should we say, it's a bag of features that you would select in order to increase the capacity, the efficiency of your network. And by far the most common feature of LTE Advanced which is being deployed is this thing called carrier aggregation, because that's all about spectrum. Okay, more spectrum, more capacity, more efficient use of the existing spectrum, which is clearly the feature that most operators are interested in. The only problem perhaps with that is that there's a very limited number of devices on the market, smartphones and such like, that actually support the carrier aggregation feature. So where operators have carrier aggregation as a service they can offer, it will be that service will have to be bundled with or offered with a specific device, because it's not a very common service in all devices, at least for the time being. But that that'll be a thing that we kind of resolve as time goes by. Right, would you move on to the final section? I'm already over time. We have far too much information to talk about here, but maybe another 5 minutes, 10 minutes or so. So if you can hang on just a few minutes, we'll get to the Q&A very soon. Right, digital services. Now, as a training organisation, we find operators more and more interested in digital services. Trying to figure out what are digital services, what do we do with them, what does it mean to the business, and so on. So. Well, we could look at this sort of classic view of the types of service that we would be offering. I mean, okay, we've got the classic business to consumer type of service. Okay, so when we think about the types of digital services, typical value-added services such as music and video content and so on, then that might be a way of viewing revenue protection. So we can offer a new service to the user simply to maintain the ARPUs that we would have in a system. But I think going forward, we need to maybe not turn away from the consumers, but to engage much more with the businesses. So we're talking about business to business as a way of actually producing revenue growth. Now, the second B in the business here, I mean, they may be the partners, the OTTs that will themselves be looking for new distribution channels for their content. Perhaps their advertising partners are also looking for new distribution channels. So there is growth opportunity, I think, when we look at the business-to-business market. But this is a chart from one of the Ovum reports, which I quite like, because it lists, shall we say, the typical digital services. So there's music, games, video, TV. Okay, then there's the financial stuff. Okay, card emulation, operator billing, and so on. But what I quite like about this is it shows for those different categories of digital service probably the most important market or the most important business model that applies to. So when we look at, for example, sort of IP voice services, then clearly it's a business to consumer type service, but it could also be business to business to consumer market as well, and that depends on the enterprises and so on that you might have engagements with. But perhaps, I mean, the term machine to machine or Internet of Things, industry verticals, and so on. I think this is a big potential growth market for operators, provided we get our position in that value chain the strategy associated with that sorted very, very soon. But connected cars, transportation, retail, and so on. The majority of those, we're not expecting operators to start, selling vehicles and running railway systems or something. That's not the business we're in. But of course, those industries more and more require connectivity to enable their own services, and that's of course where the B2B2C comes in. And the operators are in a pretty strong position of being connection providers, but monetizing that service and trying to figure out what part in that value chain should the operator actually play. I mean, that's the tricky part. I think there's a clear business case there for those different verticals, but how we play in that market is something which is operators really have to find out for themselves. And of course, when we think about the revenues, we're going to say, well, how much of that revenue of these new digital services do we get to keep for ourselves? Well, the CSPs, digital revenues, the sort of red marks in here, as a percentage of total revenues, the digital revenues themselves are pretty small. And when you compare that to the other providers of service, and these will be the OTTs and so on, then of course the total revenues are a lot less for those OTTs, but they're keeping a much bigger percentage of the revenues directly from those services. So there's a bit of an imbalance there. So clearly there's a market there, or an opportunity there for partnerships between the others and the communication service providers, the CSPs. Right, now this is of course it's not a new term, it's been going around for a few years, but it perhaps bears a little bit of definition here. But the Internet of Things. Now we've broken it down here into sort of two different categories of consumer IoT and industrial IoT. Perhaps I think when we say Internet of Things, then clearly the categories that we most often spring to mind perhaps would be the wearables, the connected home, the connected car, tracking beacons and so on of various types. So this is the Internet of Things. But when we think of on the industrial side, so this is the B2B2C market or business model that we mentioned just previously. But fleet management, smart metering, patient monitoring, so on. Well, this is also Internet of Things, but I suppose more commonly these types of connected verticals have been referred to as as machine to machine. So M2M services are more about fleet management, smart metering, and so on. So there's perhaps no absolute definition of what those things are. But I think so long as we're aware of the service that we're entering into is either consumer-led or industrial-led, I think the definition can take a bit of a back seat here. And of course, it will be a huge market. I mean, many different organizations are predicting simply billions and billions of devices to be connected by 2020, 2030, and so on. And the market itself will be worth trillions of dollars in revenue. But that question again, as a CSP, where do you sit in that particular value chain? And there is some tricky times ahead, because one of the key barriers that we see at the moment for this machine-to-machine Internet of Things market is that quite often there's limited interoperability between the devices and the ecosystems themselves, because there are a lot of different industry players working in this market. Those that focus on the wearables, those that focus on the back-end systems, and so on. So already we're seeing a number of initiatives from Qualcomm, from Panasonic, from Dell, Samsung, and so on, to actually create some sort of connectivity recommendation or standardization for this particular market. And once we see some emergence of a dominant standard for these connected type services, then of course the market has a clearer way ahead. So that those barriers will reduce with time as we solve some of the connection problems. And just looking at the different markets in terms of their growth here, the graph that's winning here is the energy and utilities. So it's the smart meters and so on that seems to be the dominant market in most cases. But healthcare, in sort of 5 years' time or so, healthcare sort of comes to the fore. But transport and manufacturing are also sort of major industry verticals there, in which CSPs are likely to play a big part. So, but yeah, it's growing pretty quickly, I think, in those. When we just look at the wearables, I mean, wearables it's a new and exciting thing, and the Mobile World Congress was there were wearables all over the show floor, and the predictions are that the wearables are going to increase extremely rapidly over the next few years. And of course, Apple have just launched their new watch and such like. So whether it's activity trackers, multi-purpose devices, and or just fashion items and so on, it's a big growth market. But the question is, do these wearables generate any revenue for the operator? I mean, what kind of connectivity are these devices requiring? So new usage patterns, perhaps. Okay, most of those will perhaps be over sort of low energy systems like Bluetooth, perhaps Wi-Fi. The devices themselves perhaps not requiring directly a cellular connection, but they may connect to your smartphone. Okay, and those new usage patterns, synchronizing with your OTT running application and so on, will require sort of direct connectivity for the operator. So the operator perhaps will not be directly in the wearables market, but we'll certainly have to prepare the way for that particular market. And I think something that perhaps we're not absolutely brilliant at this at the moment, but the whole big data thing. It's not a new thing, is it? It's been around for many years, but and operators, both fixed and mobile operators, have a whole an absolute ton of data about their subscribers, their subscriber behaviors, and so on. But actually mining that data and using it for specific purpose, perhaps, is something that we still need to work up a bit. Now, I mean, the opportunities for big data in such as marketing and analytics, using the big data to more tightly focus our marketing campaigns towards individual users, individual groups of users, making better use of social media and so on, directly from the big data analysis. Also, improving customer care as we differentiate more and more on network quality. Okay, the quality of experience and so on. Then mining that data. In terms of handling a customer complaint or a customer problem becomes increasingly important. Operational efficiency clearly is always important, but looking at that data and using it in a way which enables us to improve the internal mechanisms of our network, to improve the business models, to improve the way that we do business internally, clearly has to be an important aspect. And maybe even there are opportunities directly to monetize the information that we find through the big data. So making advertising, mobile advertising, making it more location context aware, for example, that will increase the value of the advertising services that you can perhaps sell to third parties. So there's still a lot of ground to cover with big data. There's still a lot of work to do there, and we're perhaps only just scratching the surface in the way that we analyze the data that we routinely measure within the network. And we've sort of finally come to the end. Apologies for running over time here, but okay, clearly things are changing. Huge amount of growth in data. Video seems to dominate that traffic. The telcos perhaps are accepting the redefined role as being sort of enhanced connection providers, working in partnership with the providers of the content. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, so long as that we establish a sort of a good playing field where we can work in cooperation with the OTTs rather than against them. I think this is the new position that the telcos are having to adopt. So the telco as the enabler perhaps would be another way of thinking of that. Clearly, the customer experience is something which is at the foreminds of all operators, and the way that we manage that experience is increasingly important. Telco strategies, it's all about connectivity. It's all about increasing speed. It's all about increasing the quality of the user's experience through the connectivity, whether it's faster data rates or better coverage. More consistent service, and all of those things, even though those more consistent and high-speed services directly towards the consumer is an important thing. As we get closer to our third-party partners, those providing the content, clearly those third parties are going to be interested in our ability to provide a consistent service to the subscribers. So partnerships are important. Business to business is important. Business to consumer, when we start addressing things like the Internet of Things or the machine-to-machine market, becomes increasingly important, and there's a huge amount of potential in that market. It's yet to be exploited. It's perhaps yet to be understood fully, and yet to be exploited for its revenue. And thanks very much for attending. Again, thanks for sticking with me to the end there. I didn't think I would be able to do it all in 30 minutes, so I appreciate you hanging around for the extra 25 minutes there. So really appreciate your attendance. And here's that slide I showed you right at the start about who we are and what we do. And there's some important contact details there about the type of training we do. So yeah, do visit our website, go to telecomsacademy.com and look at the full range of things that we do. Both on the business side and on the technology side as well. So thanks very much for that. And right, I'm going to do two things now before we let you go. And I just need to move some things around here. The presentation that we've been through here, and of course, we did it rather quickly. You can download this, so we'll drop that onto the screen. And also, we probably don't have a great deal of time, but if you've got let me drag this one in. If you've got any questions or comments, then I've just enabled a little chat pod on the screen there. So if you'd like to chat if you'd like to type any comments or questions, I shall try to answer them perhaps in the sort of 5 minutes that we have remaining. But yes, this webinar, of course, has been recorded as well. So Paul Waite, our marketing manager, he will be contacting you with a link, so you'll be able to review it again at your leisure. And I see a few of you typing, which is that's generally positive news. Hi, Sergio. So African operators do managed services. Well, yeah, managed services is always a bit of a tricky one. It's a good financial activity, shall we say, and it's not so much cost reduction. It's the way that you account for the cost. So really what you're doing is you're eliminating capex items from the balance sheet and putting them into the opex. I mean, that's really what managed services are doing. You can sort of yield some internal efficiencies as a result of doing that, but I think you've got to be a bit careful with managed services, because that means engaging a lot of maybe third, fourth, and fifth parties, getting you to do a certain amount of the work for you. So the quality of the operator and your ability to do what you're supposed to be doing is now down to the quality of the SLA, the contracts that you're signing with those third parties. So yeah, sure, it can be a solution for cost reduction, but you've got to be really careful about the way that you manage those processes. There's some clear winners, I think, when it comes to managed services. For example, in Nigeria, pretty much all the towers are handled by one company now. So all the operators will go to one company to buy space in the tower to manage those things. So there are some clear opportunities for that. But yeah, you can do it. Just be careful about the SLAs and who you engage as third parties to do those things do those things for you. Yeah, hi Keith. So how important will it be to monitor the split between voice and data ARPUs, new technologies such as VoLTE? Yeah, now that's a very good question, actually, because in essence, I suppose VoLTE, being voice over IP, simply becomes data ARPU. So once VoLTE becomes a sort of de facto method for handling voice calls, then the traditional voice ARPUs will probably see drop off fairly sharply. Now that might just be a reasonable metric to say to indicate the success of VoLTE and so on. I mean, clearly in the network we will then be able to understand how many minutes or megabytes, and therefore directly what the revenue balance is between the VoLTE services and all of the other IP. So yeah, it continues to be important, I think, because the challenge the operator faces with VoLTE is it's still quite a long way off. And in the meantime, the OTTs, as I mentioned, the OTTs will sort of continue to dominate in that space. So monitoring is going to be important, I think. Hopefully, I mean, the positive outcome of VoLTE will be that you'll win back customers from the OTTs. Now you don't know whether you're going to be winning back customers unless you monitor it. So yeah, the simple answer, I think, to your question, Keith, is yes, it is important to be able to monitor those things. Yeah, Derby, thanks for your comments. Tunav also, thank you very much. Tunav, what's 5G? That's a really good question. How long have we got? Yeah, 5G is basically pretty much every network function. So we're talking about base stations, databases, switches, routers, management systems. The whole thing is basically virtualized. Okay, so you can now imagine a future network being run on one huge supercomputer doing all of the things, pretending to be telephone switches, pretending to be routers, and so on. So, I mean, the acronym of interest here is NFV, or Network Function Virtualization, which is a strong element of 5G networks. 5G is also, there's a big modification to the access network. We could talk about things like heterogeneous networks, more access to spectrum, efficient use of the available spectrum, and so on. So there are many different things to it. But yeah, 5G is basically a very high-speed virtualized network, the way I understand it at the moment. Yeah, Mr. Wookton, yeah, sorry, that was a typo on the slide. 80% of handsets sold worldwide will be smartphones by 2016. That should have said 2016. In my hasty edit, I'm afraid I put 2065. Who knows what the market will look like in 2065? I probably won't be worrying about it, but okay, 2016 on slide 17 it should have been. Yeah, Jackie, African operators running LTE networks, what are the key revenue drivers? Data connectivity, initially at least. Probably you'd be looking towards maybe the enterprise or the business people initially. Okay, so that'll be your revenue sources. But I think you can't simply sell them connectivity. You've got to give them a good reason to buy the LTE connectivity as well. So I think the small, medium enterprises where you can host cloud-like services, so you can handle all of their business emails and customer management and so on. That gives people a reason for buying the LTE service. I think that there has to be something more compelling than perhaps just faster data rates as well. Yeah, Keith, thanks for your comment. That's great. Yeah, Claudio, thanks again. Xiaomo, thank you very much. Info. In the face of challenges faced by telcos, what are the chances of MVNO, MVNE surviving? Yeah. Yeah, another great question. Yeah, because it's. I mean, we said there's more and more mergers and acquisitions taking place. So as far as the kind of the real operators are concerned, there are now less of them in many different countries because of those acquisition. I think there is still a chance for MVNOs where there is a particular niche market. Okay, but it has to be a valuable niche market. The ones that tend to survive, or the ones that we see surviving at least, are the ones that are very popular retail outlets. So, okay, we have Tesco and Carrefour and so on. They tend to be very successful just because it's a fantastically strong brand, and it sits in with the sort of retail activities of just a normal person in there. But yeah, I think the MVNOs perhaps become more and more niche. Yeah, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. Yes, I still think there is an opportunity for MVNOs, but I think the MVNOs perhaps will be a little bit more specialized than they are today in order for them to be a success. But it has to be a very, very good business model. Even though the startup cost may be lower, the revenues perhaps will be a little bit lower on that side as well. And Chunav, anyway, testing for 5G. Well, okay, it's not a standard yet. I think 2019, 2020, the standards will be sort of complete. But clearly, there's a lot of R&D taking place. I think if you look at what's happening in South Korea and Japan as well, I mean those countries tend to be a little bit further ahead than the rest of us. So you will see 5G trials taking place in those places, but they're very, very much R&D projects at the moment. Yeah, one more question, Suliatu. So based on telecom penetration market to 4G necessary for African operators. Ooh, crikey. That's a very strategic question. Maybe not everywhere. I mean, if you take a country like Nigeria, for example, you could say that for the most part, the country of Nigeria, apart from Lagos and Abuja and so on, those kind of business central areas, most of the people there probably wouldn't benefit hugely from 4G directly, but there is still a business case for it. But I think you've just got to be a bit more a bit more precise with the strategy and the rollout for it. So target those central business districts, target the business owners and operators in those regions, and offer them services in those places. It's just far too expensive to roll out in a general fashion. So it's like one of the other questions I answered before. When you're approaching an LTE launch, just be really specific, really clear about why are you doing it. Okay, who is it for? Why are you doing it? What applications and services can you bring to it, and sell those things rather than the LTE technology directly. And don't charge too much for it. Okay, the pricing, the market seems to be very sensitive to pricing for those kind of services. So, Celiato, I hope that sort of answers your question, at least in part. Apologies that we don't have a great deal more time. But yeah, hopefully you got something out of that. Again, I appreciate your attendance. Do download the presentation, and as I say, Paul will send you out a link very soon. So, thanks very much indeed for your attendance. Appreciated, and I'll perhaps see you on another webinar at some other time. So thanks again.